We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
After 21 hours of closed-door diplomacy, US President Donald Trump has vowed to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. The US says Iran won't agree to abandon its nuclear ambitions, while Tehran claims the Americans had not earned its trust. Iran's Revolutionary Guard is warning that any military vessels attempting to approach the Strait of Hormuz will be breaking the ceasefire and will be dealt with harshly.
America's Vice President left here with no breakthrough to show for his efforts. After marathon talks lasting almost 24 hours, he appeared early morning looking deflated and calling it a day.
The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America.
It was, he said, the nuclear issue where things came unstuck.
We need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations.
The news from Islamabad prompted a furious reaction back in Washington and a threat from President Trump to escalate this war yet further, with the US naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which is already shut by Iran. It raises the spectre of markets plunging where they open tomorrow and clashes at sea. But speaking on a US news channel, the president claimed NATO allies will be helping clear the strait.
We have highly sophisticated underwater minesweepers, which are the latest and the greatest, but we're also bringing in more traditional minesweepers. And so I understand is the UK and a couple of other countries are sending minesweepers.
The talks here were historic and serious, the highest level face-to-face US negotiations with Iran since its revolution in the 70s. The Iranians were sounding more conciliatory than the Americans, saying some progress had been made.
On some issues, we actually reached mutual understanding, but there was a gap over 2 or 3 important issues, and ultimately the talks didn't result in an agreement.
Pakistani mediators say the diplomacy is not over yet.
We hope that the two sides continue with the positive spirit to achieve durable peace and prosperity for the entire region and beyond. It is imperative that the parties continue to uphold their commitment to ceasefire.
There's now a frantic effort by many other nations to help put the diplomacy back on track. There is so much at stake. A resumption in hostilities is now more than possible, but for the Americans, the challenge is that the use of force has failed to solve the Iran problem, its nuclear issue, and its control now, the Strait of Hormuz, in 6 weeks of war. So why should it now? Talks here may have foundered, but clearly made some progress. There is a chance of building on that, but not if the US is embarking on yet more escalation, this time at sea. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Islamabad.
Earlier, I spoke to Jennifer Parker. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia's Defence and Security Institute. I began by asking her about the importance and legality of the US blockade of Iranian ports.
I think this is a good decision. I think it is important. Now, a lot of your viewers might be confused by that because, of course, we all want this horrific conflict to end. But there is a danger here that if the conflict ends too soon, you end up with a more emboldened Iran with control of the Strait of Hormuz and a nuclear weapon or latent nuclear weapon capability. So now that this war has commenced, we need to ensure that it is, or the US needs to ensure that it is effective. So the US has probably made the assessment that they have targeted most of Iran's military objectives, so their ballistic missiles, the industry that supports it, the UAVs. Now they're moving towards a phase of economic pressure. And we got some signalling on that from the US a couple of weeks ago when Trump was putting out some tweets about power plants and things like that, which was largely condemned. This blockade is a way, if done effectively, which is an if, to apply economic pressure to Iran without undermining Iran's long-term infrastructure.
And as you said, it's legal too under international maritime law and conflict, the laws of conflict, but there are some caveats. I mean, they've got to let humanitarian aid and supplies through.
Look, there are a number of caveats. So, look, whether you agree or not this was a lawful war that was entered into, either way, international humanitarian law, law of armed conflict and the law of naval warfare applies to the conduct of that war. Now, blockades are legal. There needs to be certain things applied. So, one, it can't affect neutral ports, so ports in UAE, ports in Iraq, etc. Two, as you mentioned, they need to allow food supplies to go through. You can't starve out a population. And so the US will comply with that. But what they will do, I suspect, is focus on stopping Iran's oil and also stopping the rumours of resupplies that China is planning on resupplying manpads, so shoulder-launched anti-air missiles into Iran. So they'll be isolating Iran to ensure that they don't get the oil in and out, but they don't get any more military capability from friends.
The other thing that I guess it does is provide a reassurance. You've written in the last couple of days about the need to reassure commercial shipping that it is safe to once again transit the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, so a lot of people have said the Strait of Hormuz is closed, Iran has complete control. Neither of those things are actually true. What has happened is Iran has attacked 29 ships, which has deterred shipping from going through. There have actually been about 130 ships that have gone through that strait in the last 6 weeks, but normally you see 130 a day, so a clear reduction. So how do you encourage ships to go through? You need to demonstrate it's safe. How do you do that? Naval presence, assuring that you are limiting Iran's ability to attack ships and communicating with merchant shipping. And so the US warships that went through the strait on Sunday morning, I think was the first start of that phase. There are mine clearance assets on their way, transiting through the Indian Ocean now, it looks like, and then there is the blockade. So this is about encouraging shipping that it is safe to go through that strait.
And the big question is, has Iran mined the Strait of Hormuz? Now, that recent operation by a couple of US ships, was that partly a message to the international community as well, that not only were they checking for mines, but the fact that they went through the Strait of Hormuz is also a signal in itself? It
is. So the mining question is interesting. When it comes to mines, and this is why they're so effective, you don't need to actually lay mines. You just need to say you have, and ships are not going to want to go through there because of how catastrophic the damage can be. So Iran has said a number of times through this conflict they've laid mines. In fact, they've been saying it since week one. In the last week, they've come out and put out graphics that they've laid mines over the International Traffic Separation Scheme in the middle of the strait. Now, whether they have or not, the US is going to need to demonstrate that it is safe to go through. So they've said that the ships going through, the warships, were a precursor to the mine countermeasure or mine clearance operations. Now, those ships don't tend to have the ability to really detect mines, so I think that was more about reassuring confidence. But for shipping to go through the normal International Traffic Separation Scheme in that strait, the US is going to need to convince them that it is not mined. Okay. Or clear the mines that may be there.
Yeah, indeed. That, as you say, it's a big part of the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to what it once was in terms of traffic flow. Is that just the reassurance piece? Because it's a commercial operation. They're not going to take risks if there are risks hanging over their crew and their assets.
Yep, absolutely.